The crowd stood in stunned silence as the heavy stone lid slid into place. A woman's muffled cries echoed from inside the ornate tomb. Her fingers scratched desperately against the smooth walls, but there was nowhere to run. This was no ordinary burial. She was alive. Moments earlier, royal guards had dragged her through the palace gates, her silk robes torn and her hair disheveled. The onlookers whispered, their faces pale. They all knew the punishment for betraying the king was swift and merciless. But none expected this. Her name was Lady Inara, the queen of a kingdom that prided itself on wealth and power. She had been adored by the people for her kindness, often walking among them without guards, offering food and coins to the poor. But to the king, kindness was dangerous. His paranoia was legend. He believed affection was weakness, and weakness could invite betrayal. Rumors had spread through the court like wildfire. A servant claimed to have seen Inara speaking in secret with a foreign envoy. Another swore they had seen her hand brush against a palace guard's arm. To a reasonable man, these were nothing more than idle gossip. But to a king consumed by suspicion, they were proof of treason, and worse, of adultery. In his mind, there was only one way to restore his honor. A public trial would allow her to plead her case, and that was something he feared. Instead, he summoned the royal executioners in the dead of night and ordered a burial before sunrise. Alive. The tomb had been prepared as if for a great queen, carved marble walls, a bed of silk cushions, and gold coins scattered around her. But this was no gesture of love. It was mockery. Every coin, every jewel was a reminder that she had once lived in unimaginable luxury, and that she would die surrounded by it, alone in the dark. The people watching were powerless. Speaking out meant joining her fate. And so as the last glimmer of torchlight vanished from the tomb, the city remained silent. But not everyone believed she was guilty. Among the crowd was a young scribe named Kale, who had once served in the queen's private study. He knew secrets about the palace, secrets the king would kill to keep hidden. And as the sound of the tomb ceiling echoed into the night, Kale made a silent vow. If the queen had been buried alive, then somewhere beneath the palace floors, she might still be breathing. Rumors in the royal court were like wildfire, dangerous, unpredictable, and often started by people who had everything to gain from someone else's downfall. For Lady Inara, the first spark came in the form of a single whisper. No one knew who truly began it, but the accusation was simple and lethal. She had betrayed the king's bed. The king at the time, Vardis II, was infamous for his paranoia. He trusted no one, not his council, not his family, and certainly not his wife. Yet he was also obsessed with appearances. To be made a fool of, especially by the woman he had paraded as a symbol of purity and loyalty, was unthinkable. When the whisper reached his ears, it didn't come alone. It was carried by one of his closest advisors, Lord Koresh, who knew exactly how to phrase his poison. "Your Majesty," Koresh reportedly began, "there are those in the court who mock you. They speak of your queen as faithless." The words hit like a dagger. Vardis's pride was his crown, and the suggestion that others laughed behind his back was unbearable. He asked for proof. There was none. But in his mind, the absence of proof was not evidence of innocence. It was a sign of clever concealment. The gossip spread beyond the palace walls. In the marketplace, merchants whispered while weighing grain. Servants passed the tale along in kitchens. Inara's name became tangled in every murmur. Still, she remained unaware of the true storm gathering against her. She sensed the king's growing coldness, but she told herself it was another passing mood. She had endured his tempers before. What she didn't know was that in a private chamber, Vardis had already summoned his truth-finders, brutal interrogators tasked with uncovering treachery. It would question her ladies-in-waiting, threaten her maids, and pull apart her every action for signs of guilt. One servant broke under the pressure. She told them she had seen a shadow slipping from the queen's chambers late at night. She swore she recognized the figure as Captain Mail, commander of the royal guard. It was a lie, but once spoken, it was enough. By the end of that night, Vardis's decision was made. The queen would not stand trial. There would be no public hearing. Instead, he would deal with the matter in a way that ensured no more whispers, by silencing her forever. But his method would not be a sword nor poison. Vardis believed a faithless queen should die as the liars of the underworld did in old legend, suffocated in the earth, left to the worms. And so, plans were drawn for a burial of a woman still breathing. The court didn't yet know, but the pit was already being dug. And in the palace, the queen was about to be summoned. The cell was barely large enough for Amara to stretch her legs. Damp walls dripped with moisture, and the only light came from a torch far down the corridor. The guards had given her no food, only a clay jug of stale water. Yet, despite her hunger and fear, she refused to weep. She knew the king would be expecting her to break, to beg, to admit to a crime she hadn't committed. On the third night, the king himself appeared. His golden crown glinted in the torchlight, but his eyes were colder than the dungeon's stone. He stood in silence for a long time, as if savoring the sight of her chained. Then he spoke in a voice that dripped with false sorrow. "You disappointed me, Amara," he said. "I gave you everything, and you gave yourself to another." Amara lifted her head. Her voice was hoarse, but steady. "I have done nothing. Your spies lie to you." The king's jaw tightened. No one had spoken to him like that in years. His hand twitched toward the dagger at his side, but he didn't draw it. Instead, he stepped closer and whispered, "You will confess before the court at dawn, or you will meet the earth sooner than you expect." Her heart pounded, but she refused to drop her gaze. "And bury me, but I will not die with a lie on my lips." Her defiance rattled him. Few dared to challenge his authority, especially in private, but his pride was too wounded to let her go. She would not confess. He would turn her punishment into a spectacle. That way the court and the kingdom would see what happened to those who humiliated the crown. As he turned to leave, Amara spoke again, forcing her words through the thick silence. "If you do this, your people will remember me as innocent, and you as a murderer." The king froze for a moment, his back to her. Then without a word he left the dungeon, his footsteps echoing off the stone. The next morning, she was dragged before the court. Nobles whispered in the galleries, their eyes darting between the king and the woman they once called queen. When the accusations were read aloud, Amara stood straight, her chains clinking softly. "I am innocent," she said, her voice carrying across the hall. The king's face hardened. He raised his hand and gave the order, the sentence, to be buried alive before sunset. But as the court gasped, one figure in the crowd leaned forward, eyes narrowing. A man who might just know the truth that could save her. They gave her no chance to defend herself. The king's verdict was carried out with the cold efficiency of a machine that had done this before. A shallow grave was dug in the palace courtyard, surrounded by high stone walls, so the public could not witness the scene. Her hands were bound in front of her, and her mouth was gagged to stop her from calling out. The king did not want her cries to stir sympathy among the guards. She was forced to kneel in the dirt. The executioner's men she had once served food too would not meet her eyes. They moved like ghosts, avoiding any trace of emotion. Every sound seemed magnified, the thud of the shovel hitting the ground, the rustle of the king's robes as he stood watching from the balcony above. One guard hesitated, shifting uncomfortably as he looked toward her. She caught his gaze for only a second, but it was enough to remind her that not everyone believed the lies. He was young, barely more than a boy, and his knuckles whitened as he gripped his spear. But he said nothing. No one dared to. The soil around her knees grew damp with her sweat and tears. She could hear the murmurs of the women who had been ordered to bring stones to mark the grave. Among them, she recognized a familiar voice, a handmaiden who had once been her closest friend. That friend's eyes glistened, but her lips stayed shut. When the first shovelful of dirt fell against her feet, panic exploded in her chest. The weight of earth was more terrifying than any sword. She twisted her hands, desperate to free herself, but the rope only cut deeper. Her muffled screams vanished into the air, unheard beyond the stone walls. Up on the balcony, the king did not move. His face was carved in stone, but his fingers tapped the railing once, twice, again. He was waiting for something. Perhaps for the moment when her eyes lost their light. Perhaps for the moment when no one would dare to speak of her again. But as the dirt rose higher, she felt an odd clarity. This was not justice. This was not punishment. This was the king's fear, that she knew something he didn't want the world to hear. And if he feared it this much, then maybe she still had power even now. The young guard shifted his weight again, as if ready to step forward until a hand gripped his shoulder from behind. And that's when the real danger revealed itself. That night, the palace was alive with whispers, but the air was heavy with dread. Torches flickered along the courtyard walls, their flames stretching long shadows across the stone. At the center of it all stood a wooden coffin. Hastily built, yet polished enough to show this was not an execution for a commoner. This was a royal decree. The king emerged from his chambers, dressed not in mourning black, but in a robe of deep crimson, embroidered with golden serpents. His eyes, sharp and unblinking, scanned the small crowd gathered in the courtyard. Court officials, soldiers, and a few carefully chosen noble spectators. The queen, bound at the wrists but still wearing her ceremonial jewels, stood before the coffin. She looked pale, yet strangely calm. As the drums began their slow, deliberate beat, a royal herald stepped forward to announce the crime. The queen, consort of His Majesty, stands guilty of adultery against the divine crown. By the king's sacred right, she shall be buried alive as a warning to all. A gasp rippled through the crowd. No one dared speak against it. The palace guards began to move forward, their boots striking the stone like hammer blows. But just as they approached, the queen lifted her head and looked directly at her husband. Her voice, quiet yet unshaking, cut through the night. "You accuse me without proof? But remember, the earth you bury me in will remember my truth, even if your court forgets it." The king's jaw tightened. He gave a single nod, and the soldiers pushed her toward the open coffin. The wood creaked as she stepped inside. The drumming grew louder, almost frantic, as the lid was lowered. Some claimed they saw her lips moving, perhaps whispering a final prayer or curse. When the coffin was sealed, the king raised his hand. The crowd parted, and a small procession carried the coffin toward a pit at the far end of the courtyard. Torches illuminated the freshly dug earth, and the shadows of the soldiers fell like tall black bars across the grave. Shovelfuls of dirt began to fall. The sound was dull, heavy, and final. Somewhere, faintly, a cry could be heard, or perhaps it was just the wind through the palace walls. By the time the last mound of soil was packed down, the night had gone still. The king turned and walked away without a word. But among the servants, a story began to take shape, one that would not die with the queen. What they didn't know yet was that someone had been watching the entire burial. And that person was not loyal to the king. The weeks following her burial were some of the darkest in the kingdom's history. The king had expected that the execution would silence all whispers, that it would serve as a warning to anyone who dared betray him. But instead, it unleashed a wave of unrest. The palace corridors became eerily quiet, with servants avoiding eye contact and nobles refusing to speak of what had happened. Even the bravest courtiers found excuses to leave the capital, retreating to their estates under the guise of seasonal travel. The king, however, seemed oblivious to the fear he had sown. In his mind, he had defended the honor of his crown. He began wearing a locket that contained a lock of her hair, telling his advisors it was a reminder of her betrayal. But those closest to him noticed something unsettling. He often spoke to the locket as if she were still alive, his whispers carrying through the long palace nights. Rumors grew darker. Some claimed the king had ordered her grave to be built within the palace grounds, not out of respect, but so he could walk past it daily. Others swore they saw him at night, standing in the garden, his boots sunk deep into the wet soil, as though listening for sounds beneath the earth. His obsession with her death became as twisted as his jealousy in life. Meanwhile, those who had dared question the trial's fairness were quietly removed from power or disappeared entirely. The royal court became a place of paranoia. Accusations were thrown without evidence. Friends turned on each other to avoid being the next target. The queen's family, still in shock, sent secret messengers to foreign kingdoms, hoping to find an ally willing to pressure the king into admitting his error. But those messages carried a deadly risk, and anyone caught aiding them could face the same fate she had. It was during this time that a mysterious figure began leaving flowers on her grave each morning. The guards never saw who it was, yet the blooms were always fresh and always white. Some believed it was a servant loyal to the queen. Others whispered it was the king himself, torn between guilt and rage. But then, late one night, a soldier on watch claimed to hear something strange, soft, scratching sounds coming from beneath the grave. And that was when the most terrifying rumor of all began to spread. When the king's decision became public, it was not met with silent obedience. Whispers turned into loud curses in the marketplace. Women clutched their daughters' hands tighter, and men shook their heads in disbelief. Even those loyal to the crown struggled to justify this cruelty. The city's priests began to speak cautiously, but their sermons carried undertones of defiance. One declared, "A ruler who plays God invites the wrath of heaven." This was dangerous talk, yet it spread quickly. People's anger simmered not just for the queen, for themselves, because if the king could bury his own wife alive on a mere suspicion, what chance did any ordinary person have? A group of noble women, some of them wives to the king's most trusted advisors, dared to send a secret letter to the court. They begged for mercy, claiming the queen's burial was a curse upon the land. Crops, they warned, would fail. The skies, they said, would darken. People began to tie every misfortune, a sick child, a failed harvest, a sudden storm, to the king's crime. The burial site became a place of pilgrimage. People would leave flowers, scraps of food, and even children's toys on the mound of earth where she lay. Some swore they heard faint knocking from beneath the soil at night. Others claimed her spirit wandered the palace, weeping. The unrest reached the king's ears, but he dismissed it as the noise of the weak. Yet in private, his sleep was restless. Servants reported seeing him wake in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, muttering her name. The turning point came when one of his most loyal generals, who had fought for him for decades, knelt before the throne and refused to rise until the king addressed the rumors. "If you are certain of her guilt, sire, then you have nothing to fear. But if you are wrong—" His voice trailed off, heavy with warning. The king's fingers drummed on the arm of his throne, his jaw tense. Outside the palace, thousands gathered, holding torches that burned like a ring of fire around the royal walls. The crowd did not chant his name, they only spoke hers. And deep inside the earth, far from the noise, something, whether real or imagined, shifted in the darkness. The sun was sinking, its last light spilling over the graveyard like a dying ember. A strange stillness had settled in the kingdom. For days, whispers had filled the streets, but now, even the market stalls were quiet. People spoke in hushed tones, glancing toward the palace as if afraid the walls could hear them. In the center of the royal courtyard, a single coffin lay open. It was not an ornate coffin carved for a queen, just a plain wooden box, its lid resting beside it. Inside, she lay still, her face pale, her lips slightly parted as if caught mid-breath. Her hair was spread around her like a crown, strands tangled with the soil from the grave they had pulled her from. The court had gathered, but no one dared to speak. The king stood at the front, his posture rigid, his eyes fixed on her face. This was not the defiant ruler who had ordered her burial. This was a man hollowed by the weight of what he had done. He did not wear his crown. His robe hung loosely from his shoulders, as if it no longer belonged to him. No trial was held. No words were spoken. There was nothing left to decide. The truth had already been uncovered. The accusations against her were lies, spun by those who envied her place beside the king. By the time the truth reached him, it was too late. Slowly, he stepped forward. He did not touch her, did not dare. His hand hovered over her cheek before falling back to his side. Instead, he knelt. The court gasped, a king bowing before the woman he had condemned. His head lowered, his shoulders trembling, but no sound came from him. The only noise was the soft rustle of the wind through the banners above. Even the birds had gone silent. When he finally rose, he gave no orders. He simply walked away, leaving her there in the open air, under the fading light. The court remained frozen until the queen's mother stepped forward, her face set with quiet strength, and covered her daughter's body with a white cloth. That night, the kingdom didn't celebrate or riot. Instead, candles appeared in every window, a silent vigil for the woman who had been loved, betrayed, and buried alive. Her name was never erased from the royal records, but no monument was built. The greatest act of remembrance was the silence that followed, a silence that would haunt the king for the rest of his life. Centuries later, the site of her execution still carries a silence that chills the air. No palace walls remain, only a barren patch of earth, marked by twisted roots and jagged stones. Local villagers say nothing grows there, as if the ground remembers her last breath. At night, when the wind sweeps through the fields, some claim to hear muffled cries beneath the soil, a ghostly reminder of a woman's stolen life. Historians have debated her guilt for years. Some say the evidence of her infidelity was fabricated entirely, a political tool to remove her from power. Others argue she might have been a pawn in a larger court conspiracy, her beauty and influence threatening those who sought control. Yet regardless of truth, one fact remains unshakable. She was denied justice. The king himself would not escape the shadow of his decision. Whispers spread of his paranoia. Of nights he awoke screaming, claiming to see her face staring from the corners of his chamber. In his final days, he refused to be buried in the royal crypt, instead demanding his body be placed far from the city, as if fearing her spirit would find him. Her story survived not because of royal records, but because common people refused to forget. For generations, mothers told their daughters the tale of the queen who died with her honor intact. A warning against the cruelty of unchecked power. The story became a folk song, a tragic melody sung at weddings, reminding brides of the fragility of love in the hands of kings. Today, her name appears in history books, not as a traitor, but as a victim of tyranny. Her life is studied as an example of how truth can be buried, but not silenced forever. Even in death, she defied her accuser, leaving behind a legacy stronger than the throne that condemned her. And so, as the wind continues to whisper across that cursed patch of ground, the world remembers her not for the crime she was accused of, but for the injustice she endured. The king's glory faded into dust, but her story became immortal.